What's up, guys? My name is Justin Smith, and I am not a good photographer. On today's episode, we're going to be editing the image you see here, a photo that I took at Lake Agnes, just near Lake Louise, about 2 weeks ago, around the same area that I took the image from last week's episode. This time, this is of Lake Agnes itself. And we're gonna make this look a little better than it is. It's if you look at it, it's pretty dull and gray, but we're gonna make it look pretty spectacular. So jump in. The first thing we're gonna do, you can see it's obviously underexposed, just a little bit. It's pretty dull and bland, but there's no blown highlights, which is a good starting point here. The first thing I'd be looking at here, even though it's not already overblown, I'd still turn the highlights down just a little bit to get a little more definition in the clouds, just to like a -39. We're going to be boosting up the exposure here in a minute, so that'll bring that back a little bit in a sec here. And then I'd bring the shadows up to bring a little more detail in the shadows here, and now it's also not underexposed at any point in the image because the triangle's off. So now we're basically going to expose to taste. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start going up until it looks a little more even. Sometimes you're going to want to intentionally underexpose. Sometimes you're going to want to intentionally underexpose. For an image like this in landscape photography where the skies are already kind of gray, you're basically going for a neutral-ish histogram look. So, where it kind of peaks on the dark side and peaks on the light side are probably about equal from the side. So we're going to come back and brighten it up just a little more in a bit. But for right now, that's a good starting point. Now, it was approximately 7:30 in the morning when we shot this. So it was basically about 5 minutes before sunrise. So one thing I would want to do is turn up the temperature probably to about 7,000 or so. It was definitely a very warm day that day. Despite the clouds, I think it got up to about 30 degrees Celsius that day. So, it was a warm one. So I'm going to keep the temperature pretty high on this photo. And I'm going to leave the tint alone for now. As I mentioned in the last video, one thing I really like doing for mountain photography is turning up the clarity. I just find that it brings out the details in the rocks better than any other technique. So, you can see that there is some detail here already. I did shoot this on a tripod. But what I would do is I'd probably bring the clarity up to maybe about 20-ish or so. It just gives a little more definition to some of the ridges and stuff. You might not see it as much if you're looking at it from this size, but I'm probably going to be printing this one. So I want to make sure that I have all the detail visible right now. Now, the next thing I do is I turn up the saturation. I think we went over this in the last video, where vibrance is kind of like the magic saturation. Where it only saturates the colors that really need to. And while I don't know how it figures that out, I'm content to just leaving the black box as it is, because you can see that it's bringing some nice color into the moss and the trees here along the side without bringing out some of the kind of browns and grays in the mountain that would just look kind of weird if we just turned up the saturation here. So we're going to leave saturation at 0. And yeah, vibrance around 25, maybe 30. Yeah, we'll leave it around 30-ish. Yeah, so that's good right there. Now, the next thing I'd be doing is under the detail tab. Once again, we're going to mask out where we want to sharpen, because we don't want to sharpen the whole image. There's a lot of flat colors that we definitely don't want the sharpening to apply its algorithm to, because then it's just going to give weird halos and stuff. So we're going to hold Alt and Option, and we're going to see it turn to Reset Sharpening, so we know we're doing it right. And we're going to drag the slider on masking up until it's only showing the edges of things that we want to sharpen. So we're going to go pretty high on this image. Right about there, I think 64 looks about good. So we can let go, and now we can start dialing up the sharpening a bit. So I'm gonna only probably go about 40-ish, because this was a stabilized shot, so we don't really need a ton of sharpening, just to give it a little bit more edge detail. And now the next thing, I'm not gonna do any noise reduction on this image. I don't really think it needs it. We're gonna go to the lens corrections window. Now, as I mentioned in the last video, I shoot on Micro Four Thirds, which does all of the lens profiling internally. So we don't need to choose our lenses or anything like that because it's already built in. But if you notice here along this ridge, you can see there's a little bit of green fringing. So I'm going to turn this up probably to about 5 or so to get rid of that. 4, 5, perfect. And so now we know that along the edge, we don't have to worry about any weird chromatic aberrations or anything like that. So we're done on the lens corrections. And then we'll test out a vignette. I don't think it's going to work very well because the edges are already pretty dark. Yeah, it's not really adding much to the image, so we're just going to leave that. And now we can come back and we can look and say, okay, well, the image looks a little bit dark still, so let's turn up the exposure maybe to about a full stop. Let's say 0.85. It gives a little bit more brightness to the brights and a little less dark to the darks, but we can fix that by either bringing down the shadows just a little bit, or we can drop the blacks down. And if we really want that contrasty look, we can leave it there. I'm not particularly fond of it. The trees there are still fairly dark, so I'm actually going to bring the shadows up a little bit. And that's pretty good. Try a little tint. Usually, if I add any tint, it's only just a slight amount. I mean, that's way too much, and it makes everything look way too pink. So we'll just leave that, maybe bounce it up to 12 or something, just to balance it out just a little bit. But yeah, I'd say that image is pretty good. One thing I would like to do is use the adjustment brush and basically paint in a little more contrast into the far mountains here. This is the Devil's Thumb over here. I'm not entirely sure what mountain this is, but as we went over in the last video, I'm going to paint in with a lot of exposure right now so we can see where we're painting, and then we'll dial it back and add some clarity in a minute. So just paint in here. That looks awful, but that's okay because we're going to pull it back. I'm going to paint in here. Okay, that's good. Okay, and so now I have my flow set to about 37. I don't like going anywhere above 50. I find it's just too harsh. But yeah, now we can pull the exposure back, so we don't have to worry about it being overblown there. But now we can work on some localized clarity. So I turn it up quite a bit. It's going to bring out some nice detail in the ridges here, which I really appreciate. Yeah, I'd say that's almost about done. Might want to add a little contrast here just to give it a little more pop. I wouldn't want to go above 20. I find that then it starts looking pretty fake. But it's got some nice detail in the clouds here still. This branch, we can kind of make it pop just a little more. I do this occasionally where I'll add a radial filter here. And once again, it's set to really high exposure, but that's not a big deal because we can just pull it back. And what I would do is I'd basically add just the tiniest little bit of exposure and then just add some of these on some of the things that I want to highlight. So like these logs, and give them a little extra, just a little extra pop kind of thing. That over there and swing that around. Okay, and we'll do one more for that one. This. What happens if we go? Still don't like that edge there, but. And we're going to turn that exposure down just a little bit. We're going to crank up the contrast. All right. So, yeah, I say that image is pretty much done. I mean, you could go around, you could add a little more pop with some localized contrast or exposure or whatever. But I say that's a pretty decent image right there. It's got a nice foreground with the deadwood. You got a nice kind of midground with the two sides of the mountains, just kind of bringing your eye in to basically present the Devil's Thumb and the back mountain there with all the kind of rock that's eroded off the mountains there. So I'd say that image is pretty much done. The final thing you'd want to do is export it. And I mean, my personal preference is I always have it put in a subfolder called exported, and then I can just pick whichever folder that I'm working in. So we'll call this episode 2. Oh, that's not a 2. There we go. Okay, so we're going to choose episode 2. So now it's going to, you can see it's going to put it in episode 2 exported and just call it like Agnes. Now, this is just a personal preference of mine. I always export with the highest quality. It's probably a waste of disk space, but I've got tons to spare, so I don't mind. The one thing that I definitely pay attention for is to make sure that for web, you're always exporting in Adobe RGB, just to make sure that the color gamut is the same as most people's monitors. Obviously, the highest end monitors might support other color profiles, but for the most part, Adobe RGB is kind of the standard. And then I also don't resize it. I let whatever service I'm using resize it to them. That might be foolish of me, but I find that I just don't have the patience to export it in 13 different resolutions for, one for Facebook and one for Instagram and so on and so on. I just make it as large as the photo will go and then let the service do it. So we can export it and then we're good to go. If you have any questions, I'd love to hear them. If you have any comments or constructive criticism, I'd love to hear those too. What you would have done differently, what you wouldn't have done at all, things that you would have done that I didn't do or didn't touch. I'd love to hear it. So leave me a comment. If you want to like this video, that's great. If you want to give me a thumbs down, that's totally cool too. Otherwise, we'll see you next time on the next episode of I'm Not a Good Photographer. Bye for now.